Well, hello, everyone. This is Bruce Willanen. I'm the Director of College Counseling at Pomfret School. I hope you all are well. I'm really excited to be with all of you today. We have a terrific speaker, Mr. Logan Powell from Brown University. Mr. Powell spoke beautifully to your children this morning, our children this morning, in chapel, and I'm excited to have him share his wisdom and his warmth with us now. So just a quick kind of a brief introduction of Mr. Powell. He is the Dean of Admissions at Brown University. Prior to working at Brown, he worked at Princeton, Harvard, and Bowdoin College, his alma mater. So without further ado, Mr. Logan Powell from Brown University. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all for joining us. Really wonderful to be able to speak with you. I wish I could see you and engage with you as I did your children this morning. I thought it was a really fantastic hour plus of time spent talking about college, talking about the college application process, sharing a little bit about my background so that students understand that we deans of admission are human beings and we had high school experiences as well. And to try to, as best I could, put them at ease and remind them that A, they're all going to get into a great college, and B, they're really going to enjoy it. And C, they're all going to be really happy and successful. So I hope that resonated with them. After the sort of formal presentation, we had Q&A for probably 15, 20 minutes or so. And then following that Q&A, we actually had individual students come up and ask questions. And so there was a healthy line of students who had even more specific questions. And so I would say from the outset, the sophistication level of the questions they asked indicated to me that they are really, really well prepared for the college application process. They're incredibly thoughtful. They are really optimistic. I could sense the happiness. I could sense the eagerness. I understand this is a process that involves a great deal of anxiety, but let me also put you at some ease and let you know that the college counseling staff here is the best in the business. So the advice that your children are going to get, the advice that you hear from Bruce and his colleagues, is absolutely the best advice you can get. In fact, and I say this without false humility, I feel less prepared probably than anyone in the Pomfret College Counseling Office staff, because I see things through a fairly narrow lens, the lens of really highly selective Ivy Plus institutions. But I'm realistic about the fact that there's a great big world of colleges out there. And so for that purpose, the college counseling staff here are the best around. And so I hope you rely on them. I'm going to share a little bit more about myself and then walk through some of the things that are happening now in the world of higher education, the world of highly selective admissions, but also admissions in general. So though I am currently the Dean of Admissions at Brown, my experience has sort of run the gamut. I actually grew up on federal assistance in a trailer park in Jacksonville, Florida. I was born in Tallahassee, grew up in Jacksonville, single parent, never really knew my father all that well. So it's been a long journey. I knew from very early on in my life that education was going to be the key for me to get out of the environment I was in and get to a better place. Never ever imagined that I'd be the Dean of Admissions at an Ivy League institution. Not something I ever had planned. I can assure you that you don't go to college to become a Dean of Admissions. It just sort of ends up happening, and that's what ended up happening to me. So I went away to a boarding school that was a lot like Pomfret, though certainly not as well known and probably not as rigorous, but I really enjoyed my experience. I really loved it. And it was formative for me. So I understand the experience of being on a Pomfret-like campus. The school I went to was in Western Pennsylvania, very rural, very tough love, but a great place. But it set me on the path to where I am right now. And I would say it informed a lot of the choices that I made subsequent to that. I did end up going to Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine for undergrad. I was a biology major, wasn't smart enough to be a medical school student, so I crossed that off the list. I knew I wasn't going to be a laboratory scientist, so I crossed that off the list. But I was really engaged in, things like running and student government. I worked really hard in my biology classes, Tried to just make the most of my opportunities there. Had a couple of campus jobs. And when I graduated, having done so much work for admissions already as a student volunteer, I thought, I've been volunteering doing all of this work. I might as well get paid for doing this work. And so I started work in the Bowdoin admission office. I then went to Harvard, got my master's degree in higher education from Harvard. Also in Cambridge, got an MBA from the Sloan School of Business at MIT. Worked for 9 years as the director of admissions at Princeton, and now I'm starting my 6th year as the dean of admissions at Brown. So it's been an incredible journey, an incredible opportunity for me. And so I've been grateful every single moment, from the moment I set foot on my high school campus to where I am right now. Incredibly grateful for the opportunities that I've had and for the people who've been there to support me. And I see a lot of that in the Pomfret culture and ethos as well. So the plan for the hour is I'm going to walk through some sort of basic admissions information that I hope will be foundational in terms of understanding the general admissions landscape. The other thing that's important for you to know is the landscape has changed tremendously in the last 2 years. And so I want to walk through a little bit of where things are now. You'll have a sense of where things used to be, and then we'll talk maybe a little bit about where things are going. But I really want to try to give you as comprehensive a look as I possibly can. I'm going to give you the macro view, but I'm also going to sort of drill down a little bit more into the micro view. The micro in this case being the world of highly selective admissions, because I want you to see the full range. I want you to see, generally speaking, what college admissions looks like in the country. And then I want you to know kind of what it looks like at one extreme end of the distribution. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up a presentation that I'll share with you all now and walk through this. So really, truly a pleasure to be here, an honor to have been invited by Bruce. This is a great opportunity for me, and I hope it's beneficial for all of you. I think it's probably helpful to start with a little bit of levity. This is, I think, a reminder to us all that students should be able to be who they are, that they should be able to speak their authentic voice at the beginning, middle, and end of the process. So I find this funny. I hope you laugh at this as well. And it's just a reminder that what we really want is to hear students in their own voice. So let's start with the macro. The macro view is that the average acceptance rate for all four-year colleges in the United States is about 66%. So what that means is that everyone who goes to Pomfret is going to get into a great school. There's zero question about that. Yes, it can be a harrowing experience, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of the news media, of course, focuses on the group of schools that deny more than they admit. But of roughly 2,000 accredited four-year colleges, only about 50 admit fewer than 30% of their applicants. Going down even further in the selectivity range, only 17 admit fewer than 10% of their applicants. So while a certain very, very small set of schools dominate the college admissions headlines, that's not the reality that most people experience. And so this is a good reminder, I think, to all of us, as myopic as I think all of us can be about various things, and as myopic as as even we can be in the college admissions world. It's a really helpful reminder, and I say this to my staff all the time, that what we experience at Brown is not the real world. Some of the stats I'm showing you here is really the real world, which is that most colleges accept most of their applicants. And that's something to really bear in mind as you go through. I thought this was interesting. I'm not a parent myself. I don't have kids. And so I try to do a lot of research on what it's like to be a parent. And so Pew did this for me, and they indicated that 54% of American parents say that you can never be too involved when it comes to your child's education. And yet 43% say too much involvement could be a bad thing. So I think it's, I think it's important to find that right balance. I'm not here to tell you what that balance is. I'm here to simply say that what we hope will be the case is that the student applies, that it's the student's opportunity to guide the conversation around where they want to go to college. I really strongly believe one of my dear friends, Doug Christiansen, who's the dean of admissions at Vanderbilt, has several children who have gone through college, and he has this great line that I borrow from him, which is that it should be a family conversation, but a student decision. And I think that makes a lot of sense. This should be a conversation you have with your child. Ultimately, we all hope it's the student's decision, your child's decision about where to apply and ultimately where to attend. I've heard that this is the case. I am sure it is. Your kids will all be great, and I think given the time that they've had here, you've been well prepared to send them off to the great institutions at which they're going to enroll. Here's a little bit of the, that little sliver of what a highly selective applicant funnel will look like. This happens to be Brown University. This is the class of 2025. This is the group of students who are first-year students on our college campus right now. This is, I would say, pretty representative of what you would find at schools in our cohort. So if you looked, generally speaking, from the Harvards to the to Dartmouth to Stanford to Cornell, and even some of the small liberal arts colleges that are highly selective, you're going to find these general statistics. Application volume went through the roof last year for a couple of reasons. 3 reasons, I think, in particular. One, students were largely sitting at home and they had a lot of time to apply to schools. Number 2, I think because they weren't able to visit college campuses, in many cases, they just didn't know what those differences were between college A and college B that might have allowed them to winnow down their list a little bit. So I think there were a good number of students last year who, and the data bear this out, who just weren't quite sure what the major differences were between a school like Dartmouth and a school like Columbia. And so they applied to both, and they applied to Brown as well. And so that we saw clearly played out in the application data from the Common App, which is the application we use. While individual applicants last year were only up minimally, application volume was actually up substantially. So what we found was that roughly the same number of applicants as 2 years ago were applying to many more schools than they did the year before. And so what you see here is, generally speaking, the rough set of trends that we saw across the highly selective institutions. Application volume increases, very low acceptance rates, and very high yield. I know I said there were 3 reasons. I'm going to get to the third because it's going to be a recurring theme. I mentioned the first was that students had more time. Second was that students were probably more indecisive because they couldn't visit college campuses. And number 3 is that we all became test optional for the first time in a long, long time. And so we'll come back to that because test optional really did help shape what happened last year, what's happening this year, and what may happen in the years ahead. I share this with you because I want you to see, let's first talk about the circles, the orange circles there. Those are 2 Brown specific programs. One is called PLME, the Program in Liberal Medical Education. That's a program, it's a combined undergraduate and MD program we offer. As you can see, it's rather competitive. We also have a dual degree program with the Rhode Island School of Design, quite competitive. But really the thing that I wanted to highlight for you is over time, the overall admit rates and the regular decision admit rates. So our overall admit rates have come down, as you can see, from 8.3% 5 years ago down to 5.4% this past year. But you'll also notice the regular decision admit rate. And so if you're doing the math at home, what you're figuring out is that the early decision admit rate must be much higher than 3.5%. And you're right. So here's the important point I would make about early decision, early action. And if you have questions about this, of course, you can put them in the Q&A or ask them at the end of the presentation here. We'll certainly leave plenty of time to talk and answer those questions. It's important to point out that early decision, early action is not always to a child's strategic advantage. It depends on the school. There are going to be some schools who will say to you quite plainly, there is an advantage in applying early decision because they know that the matriculation is 100%. That is, it's a binding program. If you apply, you're admitted, you are obligated to attend. Regular decision, there is not that same obligation. And so schools may weigh things like demonstrated interest. One of your students very wisely at the end asked me about this and said, Dean Powell, does it matter that I didn't visit a whole bunch of college campuses? I said, no, that actually is not necessarily going to factor into demonstrated interest. But what will, and this is the level of sophistication that exists out there in the world of admissions. Being clear, Brown does not do this, but it is possible, and we have the tools to do it. We know from the emails we send to prospective applicants and to applicants, we know whether they've opened the email. We know if they've clicked on the link in the email. We know how long they spend on websites that we've sent them. We know if they've registered for a virtual tour or a virtual information session. And so I said, look, in a lot of these cases, the question you ask will be met with an answer of "it depends." So "it depends" is going to probably be the most common answer you get to a lot of your questions. But to the point about early decision, early action, is it to your advantage? Is it to the student's advantage? It depends. But the admit rates are higher, but don't read too much into that. I want to show you this because I think it's helpful in understanding academic interest as it's displayed in the application. You can see here, and you probably know intuitively, that economics is a really popular concentration across most liberal arts colleges. Biology as a track to pre-med is very popular. Computer science is our fastest growing concentration and one of the fastest growing concentrations in the country. What's important to point out here, and I know it's probably pretty hard to see because the print gets really small, but what I've shown you here on the left column is a listing of concentrations in descending order by the number of incoming concentrators. And so you'll see at the top, economics is very popular, followed by biology and computer science, political science, engineering, and so on. But what you'll also see is towards the bottom, those less popular concentrations like Judaic studies, like Slavic studies, like American studies. These are really small concentrations, and those departments really want us to admit more students because they want full classrooms, just like economics and computer science have. And so the point of this is to say, don't try to game, and this is what I said to the students this morning, don't try to game the system. If you're interested in economics, say you're interested in economics. And if there's something specific in economics or biology or computer science that has your attention, be as specific as you can in those larger areas of concentration. However, if your child is more interested in one of these less popular concentrations, we pretty quickly see through it when it's used as a strategy and not authentic. So for example, the student who's interested in Slavic studies, but has never been to a part of the world represented by Slavic language, that's maybe going to be a tip-off. If there's no evidence that there's interest in Slavic languages, then we're going to wonder where it came from. And so I would say in these areas of concentration that are less popular, as long as there's real demonstrated commitment to it, it can actually be to a student's advantage. I showed your children this morning because I think it's really important to remind them that it's totally okay to be undecided. I was undecided. I had no idea what I was going to do when I got into college. And as you can see here, this is the actual first-year class at Brown. You can see that a plurality of our first-year students have no idea what they want to do. And that's totally, totally fine. It's fine as a first-year student. It's fine as a sophomore. We hope that they start to figure things out a little bit more in terms of a path. And we have a lot of advice. All of the colleges and universities that your children will attend will have layers of advising to help them get through their 4 years and on from there. I show you this because even though we read applications, almost all of us, by the way, I communicate with schools that are very similar to Brown. We have frequent phone calls within the Ivy Plus group just to talk about trends. We don't compare in advance policies, but we do talk about trends. And so it's important for you to know that though all of us read regionally, what that means is that there's someone who is dedicated to reading all of the applications that come from Pomfret. And that's the case even at large land grant institutions. So, someone at Michigan State, someone at Berkeley is probably responsible for reading all of the applications from Pomfret. And so what's important for you to know is that applicant pools at every level are increasingly national rather than regional. Part of that has to do with changing demographics. So what this shows, and I think it's fairly clear, it's a really interesting data visualization that was done by the Washington Post that I think is interesting. You don't need to be a fan of the Washington Post. This is just an interesting data visualization that they put together that I thought was really helpful. And what it shows is changes in population from 1920 to 2020 based on census data. And what you can see pretty clearly is that there is a population reduction in the Northeast of the United States and the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt of the United States. There's huge growth in the Southwest, the Southeast, and though I didn't have room for it on this slide, in California as well. And that's reflected in our applicant pool. So even though application volume is growing everywhere, it's growing at an enormous rate in the Southwest, Southeast, and in California. In fact, at Brown and at Harvard and at Princeton and many other institutions, California is the single most populous state by state residency in our undergraduate population. So our applicant pools are national. Our applicant pools are international. We have thousands of applicants from outside the United States. Those applicants at many state institutions decreased from roughly 2017 to roughly 2020. They're picking back up again now. We never had a reduction in international student application interest. Remains a huge part of our process. And so I remind everyone that our process is not just one that focuses on New England schools. We have applicants from all over the world. And you should see, based on these demographics, how the application process and how I should say the population of applicants is changing. This is the actual list of both recommendations and requirements for an application to Brown. Now, this is specific to Brown, but this, if you change that shield to any selective institution, it would look almost exactly the same. We all use either the common application or the coalition application. Many schools use both. Most selective schools will also ask additional supplementary questions. I've indicated the ones that we ask here, or those that we have asked over time. Many of us will allow supplements across areas, whether it's architectural renderings, if it's vocal music, if it's a dance performance, if it's visual arts. Many of us will allow the submission of those supplements. They'll be reviewed by faculty experts. Those can only help in the process. Counselor recommendation is required. 2 solid area teacher recommendations are required. Test scores are now optional. I mentioned this before when I talked about application volume trends. This has been one of the biggest changes in recent years as a result of the pandemic. We understand that your children, in many cases, were just not able to take an SAT or ACT for the past 2 years. Things are coming back online now. It's a little bit more possible than it was before. All of us currently remain test optional. That is, all of us in the world of selective admissions. There are some schools that Bruce and others would know better than I would that may still require testing or that have gone back to requiring testing. I think Georgetown is back to requiring testing. There may be some others as well. But by and large, most colleges and universities in the country are still optional. So for seniors this year, and I've talked to counselors across the country who have told me that they have students who simply are not going to take the SAT or ACT this year. They've said, you know what, every school they're interested in is test optional. They would rather reduce the anxiety of the process by just not even taking the SAT. And to that, I say, that's totally fine. When we say we're test optional, we mean we're test optional. We've taken a pledge such that for a student who applies to one of these institutions that has made this pledge, if they don't submit test scores, we don't speculate about what they might have been. We don't ask if they took them and they're not submitting them. We don't wonder what could have been. We just read the application as it is, and we put a little bit more focus on those other elements because we have to. We're going to look really closely, as we always do, at the quality of writing, the rigor of the curriculum, the grades they've gotten, their intended concentration, and how well their academic performance lines up with that intended concentration. We're going to look at all of those pieces, and we're going to, of course, take the testing out, and we have to then just put a little bit more weight on the other elements in the application. We can talk a little bit more also about what's in this bottom right corner, video introduction. That's specific to Brown. Other places offer it, like the University of Chicago, Bowdoin College, others offer it in lieu of an interview. We recommend them. We think they're incredibly effective as a way to get to know more about applicants in the pool. But it's another another way for a student to share with us who they are in exactly their own words. This then is the actual process that we go through. So the important point to take away from this is that there are a number of perspectives that are brought to bear on the review of an individual applicant. Every application in a holistic review process. Holistic review, by the way, means that there are no formulas, there are no cutoffs, there are no maximums, no minimums. Students without testing, students with testing are always going to be reviewed using the totality of the information in the application. And what this shows you, and this again, though there's a brown shield on this slide, this is almost exactly what happens at any institution that has individualized and contextual whole person review. What that means is that multiple people are going to be looking at that application. First, there's going to be an area person, that is an individual who's responsible for reading applications from Pomfret. There's going to be a second individual, if the case is competitive, who may review a completely different part of the world and has a different perspective and can bring that to the process with their second review. We, in many cases, will have reviews by faculty. If there is a particular area of academic expertise we need to have them weigh in on. Same with arts and music faculty. We do those portfolio reviews. We then will have committee preparation. We will then go through a committee discussion. We will confirm initial decisions. We then will bring the whole staff back together again and do a final review. We then release decisions, and we work like heck to, shoe on the other foot now, try to get those amazing students we admitted to actually join us on campus. So that's a little bit of the admissions funnel, as it were, all leading to every year the best class ever. And I want to end with this because I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about the fact that though we want students to experience, a great deal of support, we know there are going to be some challenges that they have going through their time at high school, no matter where it is, and they all have challenges at Pomfret as well. So that's understandable. I want to talk about a couple more things here really quickly. Some trends that we're seeing really quickly, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A, and I really welcome your questions. I hope you have questions prepared for us. I've talked about some of the trends that we've seen develop. Those trends are heavy virtual recruitment. Some schools, even this year, now colleges and universities, that is, are in their second year of doing no in-person travel whatsoever. So in those cases, there's been a really heavy virtual presence that we've tried to make available to students all around the world. So virtual everything. There's also, I think, a real race to early programs that we've seen develop. Students feeling anxious about applying somewhere early. The classic line, I'm going to apply early decision, I just don't know where yet. That's pretty typical. That's still, kind of typical student behavior now, that they want to go somewhere, they want to apply somewhere early, and they just need to figure out where, because they're thinking about it as a strategy rather than as a fit. And so what we would emphasize is focus on the fit first. Early decisions can be great. They can work to a student's advantage. But if the student just isn't ready to apply somewhere early, that's okay. So, the old expression, the early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. In this analogy, everyone wins. So if the student applies early and they get in, that's wonderful. If they're just not ready for it, if they don't know where they want to apply early and they're just not sure, that's also okay. There's going to be plenty of time for them to figure that out. There's a lot of anxiety also developing. Anxiety has always been part of the process. I would say it's never been more present than it is right now. Students really struggling, a lot of mental health concerns, students having been in isolation, students struggling with virtual learning. We completely get that. And I would say we've never seen as much of it as we have seen in the past 2 years. It's understandable. It's okay to talk about it. We understand that students are not going to be eliminated from consideration because they had a hard time during COVID. We all had a hard time during COVID, and that humanity can come through in an application, and we certainly understand that. So we really hope that we can lower the temperature on a lot of the flame of stress that students feel by reminding them that whether they apply early, whether they apply regular, what they should be focused on is fit. There's a lot of game playing that goes into this at various levels. And I hope that the students that I talked to this morning, I hope they understand that really authenticity is key, and they're going to hear it a lot, but it really is important. It's important for us when we read that application. It's important for us to read an essay that sounds like an 18 or 19-year-old at Pomfret and not a 55-year-old lawyer from some part of the country. So we're going to spend a little time talking a little bit more about the questions that you have, and so we'll talk a little bit more, by the way, about teacher recommendations and how teacher recommendations can support a student. It's really helpful to us to have that perspective. One of the things that all colleges and universities look for, whether they require 2 teacher recommendations, 1 teacher recommendation, or some iteration of that, is we want a sense that that we're admitting students who are going to be intellectually curious and intellectually engaged scholars in the classroom. Teacher recommendations are really helpful in understanding that. So for us and my perspective, what's most helpful is not that a student have 2 science recommendations or 2 humanities recommendations. What's really important is that your children choose 2 teachers who are going to write well about them, regardless of the grade they got, but can really talk about their engagement in the classroom, and have that show through to allow us to understand a little bit more who they might be in our classrooms. So I also, by the way, get a number of questions from students asking if they should submit more than 2 letters of recommendation. Most selective institutions require 3, 1 from the counselor, 2 from solid area academic teachers, and that's it. 3 recommendations is the requirement. Students will very often ask about submitting additional ones. They're not required. I would say, think of the application as like a puzzle. If there are additional perspectives that can be helpful, it's fine, but it's certainly not required. I learned long ago, there's I think you probably all know this, an important concept in economics, and it's called the point of diminishing marginal utility, or point of diminishing returns is the shorthand for that. And the point of that is that more is not always better. A thick folder, as we used to call it, is not always a better folder. And so focus on quality rather than quantity, and that will, in almost every case, pay off. So I'm turning now to the questions in the chat, and let me just take a quick look. I see these questions. Let me just read through here really quickly. Okay, so starting here with the question that came in, because this was a question that I got probably 3 or 4 times from the students this morning. And the question here is, if a student goes to Pomfret but is from California, do you consider that student a California student or a Connecticut student? So this is a really good question. I got this question from a couple students today who come from different parts of the world. In fact, a student who is a US citizen but has family in China, a student from another part of the world. I don't want to get into the details. I don't want to reveal too much about the questions they asked, but this was a typical theme that came through, and it's a really good question. So here's the answer, and the answer is it depends. And so in this particular case, the way that most schools will read applications is by school group. Most of us will read by what we call geography. And so in this case, this is the full range of schools. So again, Brown, Harvard, Michigan State, Vanderbilt, University of Chicago, Berkeley, UCLA, almost all of them, and in fact, probably all of them in this case, are going to read Pomfret applications as a group, regardless of where those students come from, because it's really helpful to us to read in a school group so that we know, generally speaking, what kind of themes are developing. So if we, for example, We understand there were some changes in grading methodology as a result of COVID. It's helpful to see that consistently through all of the applications. And so being able to see those trends in a school is really helpful. Also really important to point out, I'll reiterate this once again, there are no caps on the number of students we can admit by high school. So my answer to you should not send you into a panic because you think we can only admit 2 students or 3 students or 1 student or whatever number you pick. That's not the case at all. Any one of us can admit 0 to every applicant who applies from Pomfret. It just depends on the year. So yes, schools will do this a little bit differently. Let me give you only one variation to this, and then we'll go on to the other questions. The only variation to this that may come out sometimes is with international students. So students who are international citizens who are also applying for financial aid. When they apply to institutions, colleges and universities that are need aware for international students, it may be that they're read as part of the Pomfret school group, but there may also be someone from the international team who would weigh in on that application. That's the only variation that will occur sometimes. Vast majority of the time, though, all of the applicants from Pomfret will be reviewed in the Pomfret context. Okay, let's see the other question. So does that mean corresponding to the population increases and decreases regionally, that you have more applicants from the Southwest than from the Northeast overall? So more applicants from New Mexico than from New York, for example. Good question. Yes and no. So yes, more applicants from, say, the Southeast than the Northeast, but it depends a little bit on how you define Northeast. We have a huge number. All of us have huge numbers of applicants from New York. So in rank order, very quickly, I would say we are, all of us at the selective level. California is usually number 1. New York is usually number 2. Florida, Georgia, Texas round out in some way the top 5. Connecticut is top 10. Maybe, but again, the volume doesn't determine how many students we necessarily will admit from those regions. So just because we have a lot of applicants from an area doesn't mean we take a lot of them. I'll give you a quick example of this. We have a lot of applicants from outside the United States. Doesn't mean we're going to admit a lot of them. That's just the reality of a selective admissions process. So I would not equate I wouldn't draw a straight line between the number of applicants we see in an area and advantages or disadvantages to being from that area, if that makes sense. We're always going to be looking at the strongest applicants from wherever they come from, whether it's New Mexico, New York, Pomfret, or Bangladesh. We're looking for a full range of perspectives on our campus in the same way that Pomfret wants a range of perspectives represented on campus. So it's really, it's fascinating here. 20% of the Pomfret population are students from outside the United States. 20% are self-identified domestic students of color. Students are here with financial aid support. So that same kind of diversity of perspective that is so appealing about Pomfret is what we also want at the college and university level. And so understand that we want a range of perspectives grounded in academic excellence. Okay. Let's see, for a student who does 5 years of high school, either reclassify as a sophomore, repeat sophomore year at 2 different schools, or does a 5th year PG, how do you calculate a GPA? Okay, so if I'm understanding this, the student does 5 years, either you repeat as a sophomore. We have students, by the way, many of them repeat freshman year, 9th grade, or do a PG year. How do you calculate the GPA? Again, this will vary a little bit. So it depends from college to college, university to university, how they're going to address this. In general, we look at a cumulative GPA. Most of us, though, I would say, now these are 2 different questions. A PG year is in fact quite different than a repeat 9th grade or sophomore year. The reason it's quite different is that many of us really would focus on the 9 through 12, even if there were repeated grades within there. And in the PG year, we would say, well, this is just bonus. they've gotten a really good foundation. What are they doing in the PG year? Are they really, sort of honing in on working on a language skill or building up their quantitative reasoning skills? We would look at that kind of specific focus. Most of us, though, I would say, and I can't speak for every university in the country, most of us will focus on the 9 through 12, including repeat years, use that as a cumulative GPA. Some schools will recalculate an unweighted GPA just for consistency. Some schools will use a weighted GPA. It really, the reason it depends on what the school gives us, and it depends on whether or not that institution, the college or university, will recalculate an unweighted GPA using only the solid area academic courses. So bear that in mind, by the way, because families come to me all the time and they say, my kid has a 4.2 GPA. What are their chances? And I say, well, I have no idea. A 4.2 GPA means nothing to me. What scale is it on? Is it on a 4-point scale? Is it on a 12-point scale? Because my answer is going to be very different. If your kid has a 4.2 on a 4.0 scale, that's one thing. If it's a 4.2 on a 12-point scale, I'm going to give you a very different answer. And so there's a lot of nuance that goes into this. And so it's a really good question. I would recommend, if it's helpful, certainly the staff here at Pomfret can help you navigate the historical record for students at a particular grade level, GPA level, where they've applied and how successful they've been over time. Might be a good barometer for you as you think about where your children may be applying. Okay, so a question from Jennifer. Do attending summer high school programs at Brown University, for example, help with demonstrated interest? Really good question. And the answer is, at Brown specifically, not really. It's not that it's we don't track a demonstrated interest. So, I'm being completely transparent. Unless the student tells us in the application, we actually don't know if they did the pre-college program at Brown. We really have no idea. Maybe in the future we will, but for at least the past 5 years and well before that, we don't know. It's not something we track because we're really focused more on whether or not the student has taken the kinds of courses that we think will lead to being competitive, whether they have been engaged in extracurricular activities that we think have taught them things like leadership and teamwork and time balance and commitment. But at other schools, it may have an impact. So think about the range of colleges and universities that are out there. The really highly selective, that group of schools that I put into that category, like those, or that you saw the analysis show, like the 17 schools with an acceptance rate of 10% or lower. We don't track demonstrated interest. It's, if you went on a tour, that's wonderful, but it's really more about you benefiting from learning more about the institution and less about us, seeing that that you're like checking boxes and checking in. At large land grant institutions, their volume is just so enormous that they generally don't track demonstrated interest. But at not every school in between, but at a lot of schools in between, demonstrated interest can matter. So whether you did a virtual tour, whether you did a virtual information session, whether your children opened that email, clicked on the link, emailed the admission officer responsible for their territory, all of those things can be feathers on the scale. And you want to put as many feathers on the scale as you possibly can. In every single case, though, I think it's really important to focus on the biggest component of the application, and that's the academic component. I think for those students who think that enough demonstrated interest is going to overcome poor grades, it's not. So if there's going to be a focus on getting good grades. That will mean more than demonstrated interest at any institution, any institution in the country, believe me. Let's see, let me answer this next question. Let's see, earlier I mentioned, how much time students spend on our website, where the data coming from, how can we make sure the time students spend on our website is included in the, yeah, so interesting question. How can you make sure the time spent on our website is included? It's automatically included, and I really don't intend for this to sound big brother-ish. It's just the platform that we use. We all use like an application management platform that automatically tracks it. I will say that for that group of schools that admits fewer than 10%, less than 10%, it doesn't matter. I don't know. I don't track it. It's not a part of our consideration whatsoever. Some schools may care. And so again, that's where it's going to depend a little bit, but it's also where I would reiterate my earlier point that instead of focusing too much on those elements that exist at the fringe, demonstrated interest, how much time you spend on the website, I would really highly recommend, instead of spending just like logging in and letting the computer sit there, spend that time doing something productive. It's a much better use of time than any time you spend sort of arbitrarily just logging on to the website and hoping they track it. But to this question specifically, it usually comes from an email we send that links to something that we want to share on our website. Got another question in the chat here about how do students determine whether or not they should submit their test scores to colleges? Really good question in the era of test optional. And so a couple students asked me this in the session this morning. And this is where a lot of test submission anxiety is coming from. Dean Powell, I have a score of X, should I submit it? Or even more sort of vaguely now, what score should I submit? To that I say, that's really up to you. My general advice, our general advice is, if you think your scores, I say this to students, not to parents, to students, generally speaking, if you think your scores showcase your academic ability in a way that will add a positive perspective to the application, then submit them. If you think your scores do not add that positive perspective, then feel free to withhold them, or maybe in some cases, the student didn't take a test at all. So where do you get to the point where you can figure this out? Every institution should on their website list the middle 50th percentile range of test scores for admitted students in their prior class. They may also show you the mean of all admitted student test scores, and that's a good sort of baseline set of data to try to begin answering this question, because a 1,400 at one school may be in the bottom 25% of the admitted student group. It may be in the top 25% at a different school. It's going to vary from institution to institution. And so before you decide, either send the test scores everywhere or withhold them everywhere, understand that test score ranges will vary from school to school. And so the really important thing is to look at each individual institution's competitive admitted student score range and make a decision based on that. I would say generally, but again, understand that we're looking at test scores in context. Let me give you an example of this. For a student who attends school with, healthy resources, with great college counseling, many students are going to have access to testing. They're going to have access to test prep. They're going to have resources at their disposal. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so maybe many schools will have a higher expectation for test scores than others. Let me give you a counterexample to this. We admitted 2 students from Afghanistan last year who both escaped before the fall of Kabul this year. One of those students somehow, he's a young man from Herat, Afghanistan. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to take the ACT and he scored a 32. A 32 at most highly selective schools is going to be in the bottom 25% of our admitted student distribution. But for a kid who had to flee Afghanistan before the fall of Kabul, a 32 might as well be a 3,200. I mean, that's just exceptional. So understand that in every case, we're going to be looking at context. And so that context will drive a lot of the decisions that we're making around student outcomes. Okay, let's see. Next question. These are great questions, so keep these coming. Do you find students from the cultures of particular secondary schools fit better into the cultures of certain colleges? Interesting question and a really good question. I don't want to say no and have it sound dismissive. What I want to say is that every student is an individual, and we don't assume that, first of all, we don't assume that there's a prevailing culture at a particular secondary school. I don't know that we would presume to know that. Secondly, we wouldn't presume that if there were a particular culture that that individual applicant was part of it. So we really do look at every applicant as an individual. And for that reason, we don't, we don't track, like people ask me frequently, this is maybe I'll extrapolate a little bit from this question. Does it help that students have applied from this school in the past? Does it help or hurt that students have been admitted or denied from the school in the past? Every year is different. Every year is a fresh start. And we look at every single year as the beginning of a new process. What happened last year happened last year. And nothing that happened in prior years is going to be to the automatic advantage or disadvantage of applicants in this particular year. Now, certainly there are schools where we see more applications than others, but the point is that that's not going to determine outcomes in any particular year. Every application is read with an eye towards who they are as an individual and reviewed in the context of their educational setting. Okay, let's see. We have a question from Krista who asks, if our student knows that your school is their best fit on all levels, academics, programs, culture, setting, creativity, etc., and she is also a highly qualified candidate with a robust application, how can she communicate that good fit and stand out for those nuanced things that may not be asked elsewhere in the application process? Really good question. Here's where I'm going to make a pitch for two things. Number one, and let's say that your school in this case may be Brown, your school may be another school, and we'll sort of expand the base here a little bit so that this applies to not just you, Krista, but to other parents who may have the same question. And I would point to two things. One will be Brown specific in this case, but an opportunity that is available more broadly. And then one that is more universal across more selective institutions. The first is the supplementary essay questions. We all ask very specific questions that we've developed that we think are really important to understanding whether the student will be a good fit at our institutions. So for example, at Brown, we ask a few questions that are really entirely specific to Brown based on what we think is important. One is about the open curriculum, a curriculum that we have that allows students to be the architect of their own education, does not have required distribution courses. Students do have to declare a concentration, they have to take a writing course, but there are not those typical liberal arts distribution requirements. So we have a question about the open curriculum and how students will take advantage of it. We have another question that gets to the point of ideological diversity. We want to understand when students have been confronted with an individual or a concept with which they or with whom they disagreed, what was that disagreement and how did they resolve the disagreement? Because we really embrace the notion that at Brown, we want students who come from a wide range of perspectives. We want those perspectives to be shared on campus, but we want them to be shared in a civil and respectful way. And so we look for evidence that students have been able to do that, and we ask that question. And then thirdly, because we know students have been so challenged in the last 2 years, we know there's been a ton of hardship, isolation, difficulty. We know that there are also things in their lives that bring them joy. And so the third essay question we ask is about the things that they do that bring them joy day to day. So big picture speaking, we all will ask different questions. And we know when you're not answering our question. So true story. I had a student who emailed me 2 days ago and, in the first sentence, professed his love for Brown. In the second sentence, professed his love for the Brown Business School. And in the penultimate sentence, talked about how much he loved Harvard College. And then wrapped up by saying, I really hope I'm admitted to Brown. And so I had to laugh. And in my response, I said, well, we don't really have a business school, number one. Number two, you seem to be in love with Harvard. Good luck wherever you're applying. But that was not a particularly helpful email to receive from that student. And so I would say that level of specificity really is helpful and something that we pay attention to in the process. The second thing I want to point to really quickly, I'll answer this part and then I'll answer one more question and then we'll wrap and let you all get back to your mornings, afternoons or evenings or middle of the nights, wherever you are right now. The second thing I want to point you to is any opportunity that a student has to speak in their own voice. And so the specific element that I'm speaking to here is, for us, what we have as an opportunity called the video introduction. It's a 2-minute opportunity for a student to speak to us in their own words, tell us anything they want about who they are, what makes them tick, why they're interested in Brown. Very often they're sharing their favorite recipes with us. They give us a tour of their hometown. They introduce us to their pets. It's just a great opportunity to learn more about them. And so it's really, really helpful to be able to have that. Some schools will offer alumni interviews. They'll offer staff interviews. I talked to a colleague at Syracuse. They do on-campus or virtual staff interviews. So I would say any opportunity you have to demonstrate that fit as a student, take advantage of that opportunity. Okay, let's see. I think the last question for the webinar here. Can you speak to how you assess the rigor of a transcript/school across the applications you receive, especially in the context of that applicant's performance? Yeah, really good question. So what we do in every case is, well, let me start with this. In no case do we compare a student from Pomfret to a student at any other school. We never compare a student at Pomfret to a student at any other school. What we do is look at the students from the Pomfret context in the Pomfret context. So we look at what courses have been available to them, and we look to see what level of challenge they've taken advantage of, and then their level of academic performance within that. So I think what happens is students very often get caught up in this idea that we're going to compare. I think there's this notion that if I could ask, I would ask you to like raise your hands and tell me how many of you have seen the movie Admission with Paul Rudd. I was unfortunately part of that movie because it was filmed at Princeton. And the time that I was there, I had to read the original manuscript. I had to read the first draft of the book, and I was on set as an advisor to the movie. And I can't tell you the number of times people would come up to me afterwards, because I was at Princeton at the time, and they would come up to me and they would say, "Is that really the way it works? Do students actually come in and you just dismiss them or admit them like that?" And I would say, no, it's a fiction. It's Tina Fey and Paul Rudd. Like, it's not a documentary. It is entirely fiction. That's not the way admissions works. And so I think there is this idea that when we go through the process, we have these stacks of applications on the table, and we compare student A to student B, and that we count how many things did student A do and how many things did student B do, how many AP courses did student A take, how many AP courses did student B take, and whoever has the most points at the end gets in. That is completely false. That's not the way it happens at all. What we do is read by geography. We read one application at a time, and we look to see how much the student has taken advantage of relative to the opportunities that they've had. So never ever worry that a highly selective institution, or really any institution, is going to be looking at your child compared to a student at a completely different high school. We're only looking at the context in which students are educated here at Pomfret. Let me also say, this is an incredible school. You chose very wisely having your children come to Pomfret. They are getting one of the best, not just educational experiences, but I think social experiences they can possibly have. I was truly blown away by the quality of the questions that the students asked me this morning. I was blown away by the diversity of perspective of the student body. They were incredible. They asked some of the best questions I think I've ever heard from any audience at any level. And so I know they're prepared. I feel like I met every senior in the class, which is a good thing. It was a really, really, really good thing. I was really honored. I was honored to have been invited. I'm going to turn this over. I know we're supposed to end in just a minute. I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce in just a minute to wrap up. I just want to say how grateful I am to have been able to spend this time with you. I really hope it was helpful. It's an honor truly for me to be able to be here. The Pomfret campus looks amazing, by the way. Family weekend this weekend, so I think a lot of you may be here. This is an incredible place, and so it's really been an honor for me. If you have questions, by the way, I really am accessible. My email address is logan_powell@brown.edu. Again, logan_powell@brown.edu. You really really can send me a question about anything. I'm happy to answer it as quickly as I can. So thank you again for having me. It's been a real honor. I'll turn you over to the best in the business, Bruce. Thank you all, and enjoy the journey.
Wow. Hey, what a quick, excellent, great hour we've had. I'm so grateful to Logan to come today and share his wisdom with our children and now with all of us. I'm riding an emotional high as I barrel toward November 1st. I just want to remind everyone that we do have another program tomorrow morning featuring Vern Granger from the University of Connecticut and Annie Palumbo from WPI. I hope you avail yourselves of the opportunity to come and learn more tomorrow. And by all means, say hi if and when you see me around the field house. Thank you very much for being here today, and mad props to Logan. Take care, everyone. Thanks a lot.